Since 1959, Cubans haven't had access to American cars, and what they did get in the years between the Cuban Revolution and today came from Eastern Europe. I'm Craig Fitzgerald, and I'm the editor at BestRide.com. We had the chance to hang out with the folks from Car Talk on an excursion to Havana to see firsthand how the people there have managed to drive without the help of the biggest car producer on earth. Our guide for the tour of Cuba's car culture was Peter Kornblum, author of many cars on Cuban-American relations, including The Great History, Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. He's a regular contributor to The Nation, and he's the director of the National Security Archive's Chile Documentation Project and the Cuba Documentation Project. He's also a Car Talk fan, and he invited Ray Magliozzi, Car Talk staff, and myself to Havana to get a look at Cuba's car culture and the superhuman effort that Cubans put into keeping their cars running. Cuba has robust trade with Russia and China, and it also has a fair amount of trade with Canada, which supplies a lot of things like body filler and paint. What they don't have is ready access to replacement parts. If we have a rusty fender on a 57 Chevy Bel Air here, we call up Classic Industries and have one drop shipped to the house. In Cuba, they just make their own. Julio Alvarez showed us how it's done. He's got a custom-made jig at Nostalgia Car, and his team can bend up a fender rather than ordering it from a catalog. By far the most plentiful cars in Havana are Russian Ladas. They're a copy of a Fiat 124 from the 1970s. 40 years after the Soviet Union began exporting these stout little sedans and wagons to Cuba, they still represent about 30% of all the cars on the road. From the Cuban Revolution forward, America stopped exporting cars to Cuba, and as a result, the only American cars you'll find here are those built before 1959. We expected to see a lot of Fords and Chevys, but the most common American car you'll find here is a Buick. It makes sense if you think about the Americans that were coming to Cuba in the 1950s. They were tourists, and they had wallets packed full of cash, ready to spend at Cuba's many casinos and nightclubs. These were people who expected a certain level of luxury, and as a result, the Buicks were pretty well represented here. During the 90s, Cuba went through what the government called the special period. It coincided perfectly with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Cuba lost its greatest patron, and as a result, it needed to make some serious changes. One of them was an attempt to protect Cubans from the rising price of gasoline. The government purchased tens of thousands of Kia and Hyundai diesel engines and sold them to ordinary Cubans who drove cars from the 1950s. Cubans bought those engines and retrofitted their American cars to accept the small diesels. Our driver, Adele Garcias from Nostalgia Car, told us that most cars still ran their original differentials, which weren't really optimized to power a big car in the city. He and many other Cubans were waiting for friends to return from the United States with 410 ring and pinion sets so they could get better acceleration in the city. We also assumed that the roads in Cuba were degraded to the point of impassability, but that's not the case at all. Our driver Adele did say, in Cuba we don't have potholes, we have tank holes. But we asked Car Talk's Ray Magliozzi his impression of the roads in Havana.
I'm not sure that any of the roads has had anything done to them in 57 years. But they're in pretty darn good shape, at least the ones we've driven on. I've been told that when you get out into the countryside, the roads are pretty bad, but that's true in almost any undeveloped country. But the roads that we've been on in and around Havana are all pretty adequate. Some potholes here and there, but I would say on average, they're not a heck of a lot worse than Boston. They really aren't. Of course, they don't have snow and ice to contend with and salt and whatnot, but they also don't have the capacity to repair them. So they haven't, fortunately for them, they must have been well built to begin with, and they're hanging in there. You know, the roads were a big surprise.
The secondary roads in the cities had issues for sure, but the major highways were made of concrete, and they were probably poured in the 1950s sometime. They were in remarkably good condition for their age. From the moment we arrived to the second we left, Havana was cloaked in a constant haze of black diesel smoke, and it was so thick you could taste it. It's a country that's begging for an influx of decent used cars from the late 1990s and early 2000s to step up to modern safety and emission standards without huge expense. Seeing the lengths that these proud, hard-working people have gone to in order to keep their cars running was an inspiration. If Cubans can wring decades of use out of a Lada from the 1970s, we should be thinking about our own disposable culture and how we can extract as much use out of a car as possible. I'm Craig Fitzgerald for BestRide.com. We'll see you next time.
Rebuild this whole engine. He can get the parts and do the machining to rebuild this entire engine.